food web is to further extinctions. And as you strip out species and strip out lengths, you also strip out robustness to future perturbations. And this was just a little, the figure was kind of redone from this little piece in Scientific American a few years ago. So, so that's that. Now let's hop over to Egypt, or down to Egypt. This was work done by a former SFI postdoc, Justin Yankel, who's now at UC Merced. He trained as a paleobiologist, but then got interested. Now he's, an ecologist who is very interested in ecological networks, does really cool work. This was a piece of his that I think is really, really cool. So this was published in PNAS again a few years ago. Collapse of an ecological network in ancient Egypt. This just shows a very coarse timeline of Egypt. There was a long, right after the late Pleistocene, 11,000 years ago, you have this long African human period, and then you have the great civilizations of Egypt being built, including pyramids. And you also start having aridification events. That's what these are. So you get severe drying events happening periodically throughout. And so what they were able to do, so they also basically focus on trying to compile feeding networks through time. Not for the full food web, but we'll get to that in a second. It turns out that on Egyptian art through time, there is an enormous amount of ecological information and biodiversity information about, and especially focused on kind of middle and large bodied mammals, both carnivores and herbivores. And so you can start to look, and there's of course a zillion of these kinds of artifacts, and so you can start to pull information about what species were present when off of these. And so this is a palette from 5,000 years ago, which has mostly real organisms, a few mythical ones. They don't get included in the web. Yeah. And then a panel from King Tut's painted box from 3,000 years ago, which shows him hunting a whole diversity of large body mammals. So he and his colleagues were able to pull together all this information, and so this is the list of species that they focused on. These are the herbivores, and these are the carnivores, and they have their little pictures. So this is the late Pleistocene. So this is a bipartite network, which is just a little piece of a much bigger food web. And so you've got 38 species as in the late Pleistocene, human hunter-gatherers pretty much. And then you can see the reduction of the food web across these time steps until today, when you only have 8 taxa left. I mean, so this is a huge collapse of that ecological network, of that piece of the food web. And, that's the long story short. But they also, by taking an ecological network perspective, they were able to look at things like the predator-prey ratio is increasing through time. There was so you have more herbivores going extinct relative to the carnivores. And they did a different kind of stability analysis. I mean, we did a robustness analysis. They did a kind of more of a local stability analysis. But the upshot is basically the same. Again, so this is going, from late Pleistocene to today. As the ecological network contracts and you do these little simulated local stability analyses across time, it becomes less and less stable, and drastically so in the modern era. So it's just different analysis, different data, but similar story. Again, not a hugely surprising story, of course, right? But one finally that we're kind of taking a network perspective on. And so I'm going to move from the kind of obvious thing, yes, of course humans are having impacts on ecological networks, and yes, they are making them less stable and less robust, often, but not always. Because I think the more interesting thing is when we start thinking about humans explicitly as a part of the ecological network, not just this outside forcing factor that's screwing it all up. And so this is human roles in food webs, and I'll focus here on a paper that I led, published a few years ago in Scientific Reports, on the roles and impacts of human hunter-gatherers in North Pacific marine food webs. So again, this is how I got involved initially. I mean, I was one of these ecologists. I'm like, oh, humans are so self-obsessed with themselves. Scientists like to study scientific citation networks, and humans like to study humans. We're kind of self-obsessed and navel-gazing. And so, you know, any college student, I'm like, yeah, I want to study my ecosystem in the absence, you know, my pristine ecosystem in the absence of humans. I was kind of the same way. But of course, that's crazy. Humans are a part of and are impacting everywhere ecosystems. So I got sucked into this project. I was basically cold called by one of the PIs, Nancy Huntley, who's going to be one of your colleagues at Utah State, and asked if I had any interest in joining on to this Alaska-based project to see and to like lead a piece of it that would basically look at humans and food webs that are out there. So the questions we wanted to ask explicitly are what roles did the pre-industrial humans, in this case the Aleut, play in North Pacific food webs? How did human foragers compare to other species? This hasn't been asked in a food web context before. It's been asked in a few different other ways before, but not a food web context. And then what, if anything, can we learn about sustainability? So I said, sure, let's try it. You know, kind of like the paleo stuff. Cool, let's try it. So we did. So this work was based in the Senac Archipelago, which is, it's very close to the tip of the Alaskan Peninsula, and this is a close-up of the little teeny sub-archipelago of Senac. The yellow dots show every single archaeological home site on the island, this area has been ice-free for 16,000 years, and Senac in particular has a 6,000-year human record, 128 known sites. And the idea across the entire project, which is funded by the National Science Foundation of the United States, was to explore the biocomplexity of this region and to integrate archaeological, ecological, climatic data to address different kinds of questions. And so, again, as I do throughout this talk, making long stories short, you know, a lot of work went into trying to figure out how to put just the basic food webs together for that system, and then how to put humans into them and do it in a systematic and comprehensive and detailed and evenly resolved way. And so over here we see some of the kinds of data that were collected. So these are my colleagues, Rolly Russell and Spencer Wood, out in the intertidal. They're intertidal ecologists, and Spencer did just a huge effort to compile a massive database for North Pacific trout feeding interactions, not just for our particular system, but across the entire North Pacific. This is a midden that was excavated next to, you know, many of the home sites. The middens were excavated, trash heaps next to the homes. And so you get a profile through time going down of what people were feeding on in some cases, not everything they were feeding on. This is the kind of stuff that comes out of the midden, bones and shell fragments. These were studied, these bazillions of, that's a technical term, bones and shell fragments were studied by zooarchaeologists on the project, and those species were identified. And then this also, I showed another photograph, this kind of information about feeding relationships and who was where, doing what, was augmented by ethnographic data from interviews with Aleut elders. The Aleut don't live on this island anymore, but so there are elders, they left in the 60s, there are still elders alive who could talk at length about traditional eating practices. So things that were preserved in this way were preserved still through those ethnographies. And so you can start to pull this data together, and here's an example food chain. So humans, here you've got algae, are fed on by shrimp, are fed on by fish, great sculpin, are fed on by stellar sea lion, are hunted and fed on by humans. Of course, we know this already is far too simple of a depiction, even for this simple food chain, because humans were also eating fish, and also eating the shrimp, and also eating the algae. And you put it all together after many years, again, in laborious, intense field and data work. This incredible, in this case, nearshore marine food web pops out. And it's the first highly resolved food web to include Homo sapiens explicitly, so that's not up there. I've actually tilted this down so that you can see humans. If I tilted this back to where I usually have them, humans would be hidden in the back. We pull things that have very many interactions to the back of our visualization so they don't muddy up the image of everything else. So I've tilted so you can see humans. But they're not at the top of the food web. We'll get to that in a minute. The different colors in this case signify different kinds of organisms. Purple are birds, red are mammals, mammals, orange are fishes, yellow is invertebrates, marine algae, and there's various miscellaneous things. And one of the ways you can tell the kind of quality and resolution of the food web is how many, insects or invertebrates and primary producers you have relative to the higher level vertebrates. The old data sets used to be, every bird would be identified down to the subspecies, and then insects would be like one group. So this is very highly resolved at all trophic levels. So almost 7,000 feeding links, over 500 taxa. And these are obviously not just taxa that live in the marine environment, they're taxa that also feed strongly in the marine environment. So you can start asking very simple questions of this data, like, how many things do humans feed on? They fed on about a quarter of the species in the marine system that were available to them. And the other thing you can see, I've left colored in the ones that they fed on, and they're feeding at all trophic levels, so they're highly omnivorous, which is basically what omnivory means, feeding at many trophic levels. Did you have a question?
I was thinking, but I was going to ask it later, but I was just thinking with these things are static, but the rate of these edgings and just as it's changing, so like species rewiring what they eat, and the purine, etc. So I mean,
yeah. So this does not take into account that kind of rewiring dynamic, really, because this is meant to be sort of a cumulative snapshot over time.
Okay.
So it actually accounts for all the possible rewirings.
I see.
So it's not, this is not a narrow snapshot in time. It's kind of like over several years. These are all the different species that humans would feed on. If you looked over a month, they might only feed on 5 of those. So this encompasses that whole thing. And then if you want to try to quantify this in other ways, that gets increasingly hard to do. That's a whole other conversation. And whether it makes sense to put a single number for rate or even fraction of diet, I think personally doesn't make any sense at all, because that changes through time. That's why I tend to gravitate towards research that is focused just on the structure or that goes fully dynamical. But again, many papers and arguments have been had about quantifying and what levels of quantification.
Sorry, I missed it. Was the black nose here?
The black nose are just a species that humans are not feeding on.
Not feeding, okay.
Directly.
Mm-hmm.
So I just blacked them out so you can see that. Because it could have been that the humans were feeding on a quarter species, but they're only feeding on things up here. But they're not. They're feeding all over the place. Yes.
What? Humans are sure eating a lot of stuff.
Yes.
I wonder. Could you look at this systematically and ask, why are we not eating some of these things that we're not eating? Are there, for example, are there cases of close relatives to edible taxa that are for some reason not?
That absolutely. There's all kinds of questions, and that's certainly one of them that we can and could and should eventually would like to ask. And I think we're actually pushing towards more of those kinds of questions in the stuff I'll talk about at the end that I'm doing with Stephanie. So let me come back to that a little bit.
And some anthropologists ask those questions too, like why don't we eat certain things?
Yeah.
But not necessarily in a networked way.
Yeah.
You could do it, why don't you?
Yeah, and in some cases, there's many explanations when you aren't eating things that you could be, you just haven't figured out to eat them. There may be a taboo or a norm against it. There may be some cultural ritualistic aspect about it. So, but yes, looking at a full food web allows you to get a much more quantitative handle on what the gaps might be, and is something that we'll be looking at. And also allows you to start comparing across systems, which is where I always like to go. Yes?
This is maybe a more philosophical question, but I was wondering, my understanding is that humans today, something like, the majority of what they eat has actually been genetically modified, through artificial selection and so forth for the last 10,000 years. And I was wondering if you would represent food sources that bore the imprint of human intention, and they would be distinct along that dimension from taxa that don't.
Possibly, and again, that's another interesting question that as we start to compile more of these kinds of data, and not only do it for pre-industrial humans, which is most of what I'll be showing, or all what I'll be showing you, But as we push this out into kind of modern human diets and behaviors, there's many ways you can slice and dice the data to ask interesting questions of it like that and like that. So
Is
it's great.
Is there any data that dates back enough that you can look at sort of the evolution of this network?
So
Either because you look at genetic data, and so you look at common ancestors.
it depends on what, potentially. There's some paleo data, and actually there's a bunch of paleo, if you get away from the humans and look at the paleo, the deeper time. There's a bunch of work that's burbling up right now that will start to get published over the next few years that's looking across extinction boundaries, for example, and looking at, the dynamics of network structure change across major and minor extinction boundaries. It is much harder to put together snapshots of food webs across less deep time, like human deep time. That's not to say there aren't potentially ways of doing it. It's just,
That's some of the stuff that we're doing.
it's some of the stuff we're doing, and we do have some, so you'll see a little bit that is time sliced, although I won't be talking about it so much. But we're trying to push that way. It's obviously an interesting place to go on many different time scales.
Mark and I are working on that.
And that even gets to your question, ecological rewiring is happening on very rapid time scales, or years or seasons, So there's many different, scales and temporal and spatial analysis that I think, depend on what kinds of questions you want to answer or investigate. So
Even correlation of life cycles, right, in the food web is extremely interesting to look at.
yes, and in fact, one of our recent sabbatical visitors, Andre de Roos, who's a very eminent theoretical ecologist who works on ontogenetic life history shifts from a mathematical modeling of ecological systems kind of way and connects it to both ecological and evolutionary dynamics.
You can start looking at sinks.
And one of the things he did while he was at SFI, and he's now also part of our external faculty, was to basically embed ontogenetic shifts and dynamics into a dynamical food web modeling framework, kind of inspired by work that my colleagues and I have done. So
He's at University of Amsterdam.
yeah, he's great.
Close.
Very cool guy, very smart guy. So then you can also, so this is like, okay, that's kind of cool, right? But it doesn't really mean it. It's just a, floating fact. Is this a lot of species? Is this a few species? What does it mean? But then you can start doing, again, very simple things, but that are very interesting. You can start to compare it to other species, and you do it, in this case, through a degree distribution. The simplest possible thing that people look at for network structure. So this is just a simple histogram that shows the number of predators that have a particular number of prey. So most things, things that have prey mostly have just one prey, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10, So most things are fairly specialized. But then you have this long tail, and out in the very end of the long tail are humans. We're not out there by ourselves. Cod are there with us. So cod humans are the trash collectors of the oceans in this case. So this is the generalist tail. And by the way, I don't talk about it here, but this is not a power law distribution. It's a skewed distribution, obviously. It's more of an exponential type distribution. This is very universal across food webs. And that's, again, another talk and other conversations. So all of a sudden it's like, oh, humans are playing a special role, in this. They're out in the tail of the distribution along with cod, basically stuffing anything into our mouth that we can.
So I assume that there is a distinction between, or that there is no distinction between hunting and eating, or eating something that died.
So we actually usually do distinguish those things. We will say that, it's a longer conversation,
It's sort of
but there's like
fish
the
are not
training course. There's many things that just eat dead things, or mostly eat dead things. So this is most food webs typically display the transfer of living biomass, from one organism to another. We tend to categorize the dead biomass as something else, because it's about a two-way interaction between the species. The feeding interaction needs something for the population dynamics of those species.
So
But-
you touched the, if you try to look at biomass.
Levels of biomass? Yeah,
so
I mean,
fraction of biomass that is transferred.
that's a much longer, I mean, I mentioned this briefly before, putting a single biomass number, a fraction of biomass number on any of these links or nodes, I think is problematic. People do it, and there are some data sets that have numbers attached to them like that, but these are very dynamic systems, and so those numbers are changing through time. But again, I can talk to you more about that offline. I mean, there's a lot of interesting methodological issues that obviously, that you're popping up and do pop up and get talked about a lot. So.
And small question, but this has been done also for other time frames? This type of kind of
For this particular
skewed
system,
distributions?
Spencer tried to do some more coarsely resolved versions of this food web across different time periods, but it's data
difficult,
that hasn't been
right?
published. It's not. We don't have a lot of confidence in it, and because you have to so aggregate it in order to do that. It's just
because
not
it would
quite
be
right.
really interesting, yeah.
But there may
to
be
see
other
that.
systems where we can get time steps, and some of those are in these other systems that we're working in. So, the other thing is like you can ask things like how you can look at path lengths, and if you look at what the mean average path length is, so it's basically what's the shortest path between every pair of species in the food web. Humans, 96% of the species are within 2 links of humans, and they have one of the shortest mean path lengths across all the species in the system. And again, it just shows that humans are poised to have very big impacts. Anything they do can ripple very quickly throughout the system through direct and immediate indirect interactions. And so, in the system, what we're seeing, humans are super generalists, they're highly omnivorous. They have very short path lengths to all other species, and of course, they're technologists. We're not the only species that uses technology or develops technology, we just happen to be really, really, really good at it. So, and this will come up towards the end of the talk. Again, there's a lot here that I'm not going to talk about. You can always look at that paper. We can do things like using a dynamical model, like this framework that my colleagues and I like to work with, the allometric network model, which I'm not going to go into. But we can use that to start taking some of this information about how humans fit into these food webs, and we can create dynamical food webs. We can invade them with a species that has the structural properties of a human. We can add a parameter to represent their use of technology, and we can start to play little in silico games and explorations about, would you expect there to be cascading extinctions in a system that have humans come in like this? Under what conditions would you not see that? Because in this system, humans came in and there is no evidence of either short or long-term extinctions. They came in 6,000 years ago and, kind of fit into the food web, playing these kind of intense special roles, but it didn't seem to create problems for the ecosystem. There's many reasons why that probably was the case. One of them certainly had to do with the fact that they weren't using technology all the time. I mean, they were just acting like any other hunter-gatherer and omnivore generalist in the system.
Yeah, just a question. How much stress was there from humans in this food web? Because it was a small island,
Yeah.
the human population was not, I imagine, very high.
It wasn't very high, so that's one of the reasons there wasn't a lot of stress. The other reason why there wasn't a lot of stress is it's an open system in the sense, a very open system in the sense that things are continually, if a local population decreases, you're getting things coming from, it's a meta-population dynamic, basically. The other thing is that humans, like other generalist omnivores in this system and other systems, switch prey. So salmon would come in, they would drop everything and go focus on the salmon. Salmon go away, and then their preferred food was sea lions, but they were very hard to hunt. And so most of the time they couldn't go hunting sea lions. So then they'd come back and they'd gather stuff from the intertidal. And then if the weather was really terrible, they might just gather some bird eggs. But they're constantly switching, and every time a generalist omnivore switches, it's very stabilizing for the entire ecosystem. It allows the previous prey to recover, and it's a stabilizing dynamic that we can model and show is stabilizing for the whole system.
Yeah, so I have to contradict you there, because humans went extinct.
I'm sorry?
Humans went extinct in your food web, for this example, because we left.
Well, we chose to leave,
Yeah, but that's extinct, when you look at it.
We're looking at the historic, yes, of course. And one of the things that's a part of this project, not my part of it, is to look to see what the impacts are post-human. And this is something that Stephanie knows a lot about, and I'll mention briefly, but you should ask Stephanie about that very question. So it'll come up again. So we're starting to get multiple detailed, highly resolved food webs that include humans explicitly. 2 of them I have published, and 2 of them Stephanie has published with her colleagues. I just will briefly show 3 of them. So there's the snag one I just showed. There's the Western Desert of Australia, which is the thing you should ask Stephanie about. I don't have a ton of time, so I won't get into it. And then also a more modern food web for the Tagish estuary out of Lisbon. And you've already seen this. Here, this is what that histogram of number of predators and particular numbers of prey. Here it is for the Western Desert of Australia. Humans are out in the tail here also, and the Tagish estuary, the same thing. So humans are super generalists in these very diverse kinds of food webs. The other thing to note is humans are not at the top of the food web. And humans are often at the tops of their food chains, but when you stick it all together into a food web, they're not at the top because they're omnivores. They're feeding at many, many trophic levels. And so this just shows it has species lined up in terms of their mean trophic level. And so
for a non-ecologist, how do you compute the trophic level?
there's a few ways to compute it. It's basically an average across all the food chains that connect you to a primary producer.
I see, okay.
And there's many algorithms that differ slightly. And I can show you a paper.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a short way to trophic level, to be totally correct and technical. So humans, are generally, they're not at the top. So, and they shouldn't be if they're omnivores. Basic. So again, I don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to move on to the last part. Beyond trophic interactions. So this kind of came about through my involvement in NSF-funded project on socio-ecosystem dynamics of natural human networks in Polynesian islands. So this is in French Polynesia. Have any of you been there? It's a part of France. Quite lovely part of France. Kind of like Hawaii is a quite lovely part of the United States. So this is Moran on top and Mangareva. These are 2 of our study islands. This is the last part of the globe that humans, occupied, invaded, whatever word you want to use depending on your background and inclination. But they swept across open ocean and basically about 1,000 years ago colonized all these islands out here, Hawaiian chain, South Pacific Ocean. And even more recently went to New Zealand. This is another fun fact. This is the last place on Earth basically to be invaded by humans. Australia was one of the earliest. Humans have been here for less than 1,000 years. Humans have been here for many, many, many tens of thousands of years. 80,000. And yeah. So when the Polynesians came across in canoes across all this open ocean, they brought with them their own little food webs because they were agriculturalists and they did animal husbandry. And so they came across with a bunch of agricultural things, bananas and breadfruit and other things, taro. And they also brought pigs and chickens and a bunch of hitchhikers. This is a really bad one, the rat. And so we know a lot about what species humans brought with them and what they were feeding on. Both what they brought, what they encountered, and then there's a lot of archaeological work that's gone on to identify. In this case, you can see there's Jenny Kahn, one of our colleagues. This is just one particular photograph and data from one dig about all the different fish species that humans were processing and feeding on at this rock shelter on Mangareva. I believe this is at Mangareva. And so what I've talked about thus far is species and one kind of interaction, feeding, food. But of course there's, and this is a big thing in network research in general, and it's also kind of starting to take off in ecology, is to think about many different other kinds of interactions among species and how we can depict them and quantify them and collect data on them. In the case of thinking about humans and how humans interact, what a group of us came up with, so this is work that I started talking with Stephanie about a number of years ago, and with other people involved with these projects. And so we got a group of archaeologists and anthropologists and food webbing kind of people together for an ongoing working group. And one of the first things we did was to basically identify for non-industrial or pre-industrial humans kind of the primary types of interactions that this group of people could agree on were kind of dominant categories of interaction, including clothing, housing, creating artifacts, field transportation, ritual cosmology, and other things. And out of this, sort of this push to a multiplex kind of perspective for how humans interact with other species came this new archaeoecology project that Stephanie and I are co-conspirators on, along with Spencer Wood and many others, but Stephanie and I are leading the charge. And basically what we're interested in is how human interactions with biodiversity are shaped by and have impacts on ecology. So as these humans spread out into the world and they confronted different kinds of ecologies, and those different ecologies provide different kinds of opportunities and constraints, different species, different habitats, etc. They also confronted different kinds of environments, climates, geographies, soils. Those also produce different kinds of opportunities and constraints. And then, of course, humans bring with them culture, and culture is dynamic and changes through time. They have different modes of production: hunter-gatherer, animal husbandry, agriculture. They have different social organizations, different norms and taboos, and different types of technologies and innovation rates. And ultimately, we'd like to hopefully learn some lessons from the past using this framework for thinking about sustainability of the present and future in different kinds of ways. And for now, we're focusing on 6 primary systems. Every time, especially Stephanie goes and presents this to audiences with anthropologists and archaeologists in them, more and more people want to get involved. We're trying to contain it to these 6 systems. We have a really good working group going right now. But it includes the Polynesians that I talked about, the Mardi people of Western Desert Australia that Stephanie is working on, people of the northwest coast of North America, the Norse culture of the North Atlantic Islands, the Swifterbach culture of North Central Europe, so Neolithic transition, and then the southwestern United States, which is also one of Stephanie's primary research sites, and one of the Humans and Food Web's papers that came out shortly after mine. And we don't have results yet. We have very preliminary results. This is basically a very new research agenda that it's the birth of a research agenda. And we did a AAAS symposium, 2 back-to-back in February to kind of put this out to the universe, and also for people to talk about how they're applying this way of thinking and this ecological network approach within their own particular systems, and then to give kind of an overall sort of, this is where we'd like to go with this kind of image of it. But Stephanie did a great effort at rapidly crunching a bunch of very preliminary data and patterns. And for example, this is just kind of scratching the surface. These are, again, just very simple histograms of preliminary use patterns